Take one, interview with... Slate 1, interview with Ed Bradley. Alright, okay. Can you tell me about that time that Neil saved your life?
It was...
Can you start with Neil saved my life once if you can, or need to film?
That'd be kind of cumbersome, huh?
Would it?
It was my first time covering a combat story in Vietnam. I'd only been there a few days. I had no idea what it was like to have people actually shooting at you, having only seen it in the movies and on television. And I guess, looking back at it, Neil saved my life that day because we went down the road with my cameraman and crew, a Vietnamese crew, and they were filming, and there was gunfire all around, and I was standing in front of this building in this little village and trying to get a better look at what was going on. And I'm kind of peering over and noticed something was falling on my head, and it was plaster, and I kind of looked up to see what it was, and it was at that point that Neil just grabbed me and pulled me down. And then what happened is that they were shooting at us, and the bullets were coming in a foot over my head and getting lower. But it had no meaning to me because I'd never experienced anything like that in real life. I mean, it was kind of like something that I saw, as I said, in the movies, or something that I saw on television. That was the first time I'd ever met Neil Davis, and the first time I met him, he saved my life.
Okay. You're on the helicopter that Neil came out of from Phnom Penh too. What was that like?
It was the last flight of helicopters out of Phnom Penh, and it was a very sad time. I had a lot of good friends in Cambodia. Neil had even more. He'd been there far longer than I had. And I remember being on the helicopter, and I was sitting across from Neil in one of those big Chinook helicopters, and he still had his fatigue hat on and a bag between his feet, and his camera was on his lap, and he was crying. And he wasn't alone crying. We all left a lot there, not only in terms of people, but we left a lot of ourselves there. And I think even at that point, we knew it would be a long time, if ever, before we got back there, and that there were going to be a lot of changes in that country. Although I'm sure Neil didn't know then, as I didn't know, that the regime that took over under Pol Pot and Ieng Sary would be as ruthless and brutal as it apparently is.
Did Neil have any special reason for getting out?
Well, I think at that point it was senseless for him to stay. I mean, it was one thing, I think, for a writer to stay, because you could still file copy. But for television, it really didn't do you much good to get out, to stay rather. It really didn't do you much good to stay because you had no way of getting your film out. And it was our feeling then that our job was to cover the evacuation. And the only way to cover the evacuation was to be evacuated.
What about Neil and his friends, and his fear for his friends?
Well, I think they were legitimate fears. And I think he realized that life for them would be very difficult, that some of them would probably be punished severely. I think looking back now, Neil probably realizes that none of those people are still alive. And I'm sure this is something you had to think of at that time. You just had no idea that it would be as brutal as it is, but you knew that some people would be punished. And those people who were closest to Americans and other foreigners, to government officials, to journalists, would come in for some form of severe punishment. And I'm sure lots of those things were going through Neil's mind. I mean, I sat there and watched him cry. And as I said, he wasn't by himself. And he had to be thinking of all of the years he put in there, all of the friends he had and loved ones he had there. He was leaving them behind.
Can you just tell me about the American coverage of the war in Vietnam and why there was an accent upon the Americans there?
Well, you go back to the late 60s, you had 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. So obviously, as far as an American audience is concerned, and as far as most foreign audiences were concerned, the story was American, because most of the fighting was being done by Americans. Through the years, with the Vietnamization, the so-called Vietnamization of the war, as the Americans started to pull out, the Vietnamese took over more and more of the fighting. So that then the emphasis changed. It changed from the American fighting man in the field to the American diplomatic effort, the American support effort, and the Vietnamese fighting man in the field.
You don't think that the Vietnamese were doing a good percentage of the fighting even as early as 67, 68?
No. No,
Right.
no way they weren't. I mean, you had 500,000 American troops there. I don't know what the percentage of combat troops were, but I just don't think that the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, were ever an effective fighting force. There were some good Vietnamese units, but they were in a minority. The ARVN, the Armed Forces of the Republic of Vietnam, as they were called, never amounted to an effective fighting force. That's why they lost.
Can you give me specifics, examples from your experience?
There was a distinct difference between the South Vietnamese soldier and the Viet Cong soldier. I spent about a month living with the Viet Cong. The kind of dedication I saw in the Viet Cong, the kind of camaraderie, the kind of fighting spirit, and that just total determination to win because they had a cause they believed was right. I never saw that with the South Vietnamese soldier. You might see it here and there with a unit here and there. But as a general rule, the South Vietnamese soldier was fighting because he had no choice, because he couldn't pay his way out of the draft. I mean, those who could pay their way out, they didn't fight. I mean, it was one of the morale problems in South Vietnam and Cambodia as well. We used to call them the phantom soldiers. If say a company commander had 2,000 men in his company, he received so many piastres every month to pay his troops. Well, if he has 500 men who can pay him not to fight, he carries them on the roster. So that every month he's getting pay for 2,000 guys, he's paying the 1,500 who show up, he's keeping the pay for the 500 who don't, plus he's getting more money from the 500 who don't show up because they're paying him. Now the other 1,500 know what's going on. They know the only reason they're there carrying that burden is because they don't have the money to pay their way out. How are you going to have any kind of morale in a unit with that? And it wasn't an isolated incident. I mean, it was all over the South Vietnamese countryside, throughout the South Vietnamese armed forces. It was that problem.
In the final days before Saigon fell, can you tell me examples of the ARVN running and that sort of thing?
The Central Highlands. I mean, you had examples of this all through the war. The troops who were stationed in Quang Tri, they were known as the Quang Tri Racers, because when the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong closed in on Quang Tri, they just raced away down the highway. In Bien Hoa, 2 days before the evacuation, we were as close to Bien Hoa as we could get. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had virtually surrounded the city. They were on 3 sides. Well, for 2 hours, there was just an horrendous shelling, artillery shelling into the tree line where the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were. It was just, I mean, I'd never seen a shelling like that, you know, by the South Vietnamese. And then the shelling let up, and then helicopter gunships came in and hosed down the area. You're saying, what's going on? Within minutes, out comes a convoy, trucks and cars. Are these civilians being evacuated from Bien Hoa? No. They were the mayor of the city, the high government officials, the military commander of the city, and his top staff people, and other soldiers who were supposed to be there to protect the civilian population of the city. What were they doing? They were using an artillery barrage and hosing down by the helicopter gunships to make their own escape and to leave the people there to deal with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong as best they could. You had the same thing in the Central Highlands. President Thieu said he ordered a strategic retreat. He had no choice. They were all running anyway. So listen, let's fall back and let's draw a line somewhere because we've got a situation here where our troops are panicked. So since they're running anyway, let's give them the order to run and get to a point where we can draw a line here and hold them and then regroup. But it's too late by then.
Did Thieu's statement come first and create the panic, or did it come after the panic had started?
Came after the panic had started. Came after the panic had started.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about Neil's sense of danger and almost going out and looking for it?
Neil had a nose for for danger, for combat. We used to call it bang-bang stories. I mean, he was just always there. You could go down Highway 5 3 or 4 days in a row. Absolutely nothing would happen. Fifth day, say, well, let's try Highway 2 today. Neil would go down Highway 5, and there'd be the most hellacious shootout you'd ever seen. And he'd be there. He had good sources to begin with, but he also had an instinct for it. He knew where to go. I mean, some people have a sixth sense for some things. Neil had a sixth sense for combat. And it used to worry me a lot because I really like Neil. And there are only so many times you can push your luck. Sooner or later it's going to catch up with you.
Take 2, interview with Ed Bradley. Can you tell me whether the American public switched off to the Vietnam War after America had pulled out most of its troops?
I think there was a natural pullback in one sense by the American people, because before the focus had been on Americans being killed every day. I mean, more than 55,000 American lives were lost in Vietnam. The concern among the general population in the United States was never with Vietnamese losses, it was with the American losses. As the focus shifted, and as protests mounted in this country against the war, the Americans started to pull back. And I think this country, people in this country, generally lost interest in the war because Americans were not as involved as they were before.
Can you tell me about the scenes in Saigon itself before it fell, the last few days?
The last few days were very bad. A lot of times there was panic everywhere in the streets, soldiers shooting at virtually anything. There was a day when the North Vietnamese flew a squadron of captured planes they'd captured in the highlands, swooped down from the Central Highlands, attacked Ton Son Nhut Air Base, turned out to sea and went back north. At about the same time, a South Vietnamese cargo plane was flying a route over the city to come into Ton Son Nhut for landing. The soldiers at the presidential palace, hearing of this attack, didn't know what it was, they started shooting. Here you've got anti-aircraft guns going off in the city, 2 blocks from our office. All of a sudden, anybody in the street who has a gun starts shooting. We went out filming. By then, most of our crews were gone. And I went out working as a sound man with an Australian cameraman, Mike Marriott. And there was a soldier who had been shooting at a taxi cab. And he pulled the driver and the woman passenger out of the taxi cab, and he started beating her. And then there was another officer, a lieutenant or captain, who had a .45. And he saw us shooting and pointed at us and pulled the trigger 3 times. And it misfired 3 times. Otherwise, Mike Marriott would have been dead. And just in a rage, he brought the gun up and brought the butt down on Mike's head and split his head open here. It was at that point that I decided that when the Americans evacuated, maybe it was time to leave. Not because of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but because of the South Vietnamese.
Why do you think that Neil stayed?
I don't know. Probably because I think we both felt we should have stayed in Cambodia. I always regretted leaving Cambodia. I think the reasons that went into making that decision to leave, based on what we knew then, were valid.
But you couldn't do anything about Cambodia, and to stay would have been, as you say.
No, you couldn't have done anything. You know, but others stayed and weren't killed, and I think maybe there was a feeling, well, maybe I should have stayed. I don't know. I mean, that's a decision I can't answer. I made a decision based on what I knew at the time, as Neil did, and felt it was the right decision. And I didn't want to make a decision in Vietnam based on what I had done in Cambodia, because they were 2 separate sets of circumstances.
Can you explain, or finally, can you sum up the character of Neil Davis?
Neil was a very complicated man. You tend to look at people in simplistic terms. He was very brave. At times, you might even call him foolhardy for the chances that he took. I mean, he escaped with his life by the skin of his teeth I don't know how many times. But at the same time, he was a very kind and gentle person. He cared about people, and particularly in Cambodia, it was almost as if he had roots there. His ties were very strong. Those roots ran very deep in Cambodia. He cared about people there, and which is why I say he's so complicated, because you get this almost fearlessness that he had, combined with this gentility at the same time, and caring about people. He was genuinely concerned about covering the story and about the people involved in the story, not just about the hard news, so to speak.
Was there a good respect from fellow journalists that he worked with?
Well, sure, everyone respected Neil. I mean, we wanted to hire him at CBS. And in fact, CBS offered him a job, but Neil was kind of independent.
Slate 3, interview with Ed Bradley. Just take up from that point about working in CBS.
CBS offered Neil a job on more than one occasion. The last time, I know, I think he was interested, but turned it down because I think he feared he would lose his independence. Neil liked being a cameraman and a reporter, and he couldn't have done both with CBS. I don't think he wanted to choose between the two. I think he wanted to continue shooting his own stories. And I think he liked the idea of being able to go where he wanted to go, more than going where someone wanted to send him, which is what he would have had to do with CBS. He would not have had the free rein that he had working on his own hook.
Did he have that independence working for Viz News?
He did, because he was pretty much able to pick where he wanted to be, to go with the story. I mean, he was in Cambodia, fine. We were sent to Cambodia. You know, you're asked if you wanted to go. But if Neil decided he wanted to pick up and go to Vietnam, he could go. If he wanted to go to Africa, he could go. You know, based in Bangkok, he can go wherever he wants to go.
The American networks generally treat their staff very well. Did you get the impression that Neil was happy with the way he was treated by his English organisation?
I really don't know.
Okay.
I don't think I could answer that.
Okay. Take 4. What was the scene like once you left Saigon?
We tried to land on the helicopter carrier, and the pilot was told he couldn't. He forced his way on. They told him there wasn't enough room to land there. He told us later he only had 2 or 3 minutes worth of fuel left, and he had no choice but to land. What was happening is that you had all of the Vietnamese pilots coming out with other soldiers, with their families, and they were landing on these American helicopter carriers. Then the Americans would have to push the helicopters over the side so they have room to take their own in. So you had just this incredible scene. I've never seen anything like it in my life. You had American soldiers pushing helicopters over the side. You had Vietnamese pilots circling the ships, and then one by one their passengers would jump out into the ocean to be picked up by boats. Then the pilot would jump out, or either he'd come in and try to put the thing down on the water. They had trouble landing on the ships because they'd never practiced landing on a moving ship, and it's a lot different than landing on an airstrip, even in a helicopter. So they were coming in and they would hit the side and tumble over. When they did land, they were just pushed over the side.
Was this a continuation of the panic that was taking place in Saigon?
Sure. I mean, all these were people trying to get out, and that was the only way they had to get out. If they couldn't get on the American choppers, so you had the South Vietnamese pilots running their own service.
Can you just say they're trying to get out of Saigon? Sure, they were.
I mean, they were all trying to get out of Saigon, I mean, or wherever they were based. They knew it was the end. The Americans were evacuating, so what was left for them? Particularly those who were in the military and those who had access to those helicopters to get their own families out. So they were trying to get out of Saigon the best way they could, and if they had a helicopter, that was the best way.